If you walk into any house, there is this fundamental law of physics at play that nobody ever really thinks about, at least not until something goes horribly wrong.
Right, because it's completely invisible.
Exactly. You look at the walls, the ceiling, the nice paint job, the crown molding, but somewhere behind all that drywall, there is a load-bearing beam.
He's just sitting there.
Yeah. It doesn't get painted. It doesn't get decorated. It just stands there in the dark, taking the entire weight of the structure above it, day in and day out, in just absolute silence.
And if you mess with it, well, things get bad quickly.
Right. The moment someone decides to remove that beam to, say, open up the floor plan because they want a more modern aesthetic, the entire house sags.
Yeah.
And eventually it just collapses.
It's a structural inevitability. I mean, gravity doesn't care about your interior design.
It really doesn't.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing is, nobody thanks the beam, right? They just expect it to hold. And today, we are talking about a framework that argues modern men have become the societal equivalent of that load-bearing beam.
That's a perfect way to frame it.
They are carrying the weight, but instead of being maintained, they are being actively hollowed out by the very house they are holding up. This is a framework that is, frankly, tailor-made for men trying to understand the history of our institutions before they were, as the author argues, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
It's going to be a heavy one today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We are diving deep into some seriously intense, provocative waters today. But before we get into the deep end, I want to welcome you to the show. Please, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss one of our deep dives.
Yeah, it genuinely helps us continue bringing you this level of analysis.
It really does. So today's deep dive is a comprehensive, completely unfiltered review of a fascinating new ebook. It's called Cultivating Gratitude, Generative Positivity Tempered by Stoicism by Conrad Riker.
Such a compelling read.
It is. If you are listening to this, particularly if you are a men's rights advocate, a red-pilled man, or frankly just a guy trying to make sense of the hidden architecture of modern society, this is an absolute must-read. We highly encourage you to pick up a copy on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books, and definitely go follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Now, before we get into the mechanics of this book, I need to pause and issue a very clear mandatory disclaimer to you, the listener. The source material we are examining today contains highly politically charged, right-wing, and explicitly anti-feminist viewpoints.
Right. We have to put that out there.
We do, and we want to be absolutely clear on this. We are not taking sides here, nor are we endorsing these viewpoints. Our job today is strictly to impartially report on the contents of the book and convey the exact ideas and arguments contained in Conrad Riker's original text, so you can understand the perspective being presented.
Okay, let's unpack this. Riker's core premise is that modern men are drowning in unpaid debt. But he isn't talking about, credit cards or mortgages. He means structural debt.
Yeah, it's a completely different kind of ledger.
Men are expected to carry the world, yet they are constantly told they are carrying it wrong, which basically reduces them to mere appliances.
Appliance is the exact metaphor Riker uses, and it's honestly striking when you think about it.
How so? Walk me through that.
Well, think about how you interact with a refrigerator. You plug it in, and you expect it to keep your food cold. If it hums too loudly, you kick it.
Right. You don't ask how its day was.
Exactly. If it breaks, you just throw it out and replace it. You do not have a relationship of mutual respect with your refrigerator. Riker's argument is that society has adopted this exact posture toward male provision and protection.
Wow. Just entirely transactional.
Yes, completely. Society expects men to provide endlessly, to endure silently, and to hold the infrastructure together. But in exchange, it has replaced genuine honor and structural authority with a polite, passive, completely toothless concept of gratitude.
He calls this dynamic the debt of existence, right?
He does, yeah.
Walk me through what he means by that, because it sounds like a pretty heavy philosophical concept right out of the gate.
It is, it's the bedrock of his entire worldview. The debt of existence, according to Riker, is the acknowledgement that reality is governed by strict causal debt, like sacrifice yields survival.
Okay.
Every good thing, every moment of comfort you experience requires a builder who traded his time, his sweat, and often his health to create it. That is the first premise of his core syllogism.
Hold on, let's define syllogism for a second in this context, just so we're all on the same page.
Sure. So a syllogism is a logical argument that applies deductive reasoning to arrive at a conclusion based on two or more propositions that are asserted or assumed to be true.
Got it, like a mathematical formula for logic.
Exactly like that. So Riker's first proposition is this: human comfort requires strenuous male sacrifice. His second proposition is that modern ideology systematically denies this causality, treating comfort as an unearned right rather than an engineered luxury.
Which leads to the conclusion.
Right. Therefore, the conclusion is that modern society is structurally parasitic on men.
Wow. In his critique of how we currently practice gratitude, really underscores that parasitism.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, when we hear the word gratitude today, we think of, HR wellness seminars.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like a pastel journal where you write down 3 things that made you smile today while you sip a pumpkin spice latte.
Riker is absolutely scathing about that specific brand of gratitude. He argues it has been entirely stripped of its intellectual teeth.
Right. It's just fluff.
The HR department version of gratitude is entirely passive and feeling-based. It's about validating your own emotional state. He contrasts this sharply with the Stoic version of gratitude, which is a rigorous, almost cold mathematical acknowledgement of causal debt.
And to understand why the modern feeling-based version is actually a trap for men, he brings in a psychological study, right?
Yeah, he references the 1971 study by psychologists Philip Brickman and Donald Campbell on the hedonic treadmill.
I've heard that term thrown around a lot. It's the idea that humans just kind of adapt to anything, right?
Yeah.
But how did Brickman and Campbell actually prove that, and how does Riker apply it here?
The study is foundational to behavioral psychology. Brickman and Campbell essentially observed that human beings rapidly adapt to improved or even degraded conditions.
They adjust their baseline.
Exactly. They later looked at lottery winners and paraplegics. Now, you would assume a lottery winner would be permanently ecstatic and a paraplegic permanently devastated.
Right, that seems like common sense.
But the data showed that after about a year, both groups returned to their baseline level of happiness. The human brain normalizes its environment.
It recalibrates entirely.
Yes. So Riker applies this to societal infrastructure. Think about a hot shower, a locked door, a functioning electrical grid. These are absolute miracles of human engineering. But because of the hedonic treadmill, society adapts to them.
They cease to be seen as sacrifices and just become expected background noise.
Exactly, the baseline. Riker argues that modern gratitude, where you just feel a vague sense of blessedness for these things, is just the studied ignorance of a child who thinks groceries magically appear in the refrigerator.
That's a brutal analogy.
It is, but true Stoic gratitude demands objective recognition of the causal chain. Some specific man hauled the copper wire, read the schematics, traded his limited hours on Earth for a paycheck, and built that grid.
That makes a lot of sense. And to illustrate this, he points to Marcus Aurelius. And the contrast between Marcus Aurelius and a modern wellness journal is honestly kind of hilarious, but also really profound.
It's a brilliant historical juxtaposition. Riker takes us to Carnuntum in the winter of 170 AD.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Marcus Aurelius is the emperor of the known world, but he isn't in a palace. He is sitting in a drafty military tent on the frozen frontier. The Antonine Plague is actively wiping out his legions. Germanic tribes are attacking constantly.
Just a total nightmare scenario.
And it gets worse. His most trusted general, Cassius, is months away from declaring a revolt. Materially and psychologically, Marcus has every reason to just collapse into despair.
Most of us would. We'd be venting on social media to anyone who would listen.
But he doesn't vent. He opens his private journal, what we now call meditations, and writes things like, "When you have assumed discomfort as natural, you will not count it as harm."
Wow.
Riker emphasizes that Marcus was not doing modern therapy here. This was not naive optimism or manifesting a better day. This was a man settling his accounts with reality itself.
He treated existence as a loan.
Yes, a loan that demanded repayment through rational, generative action, regardless of how miserable the conditions were. He didn't journal to validate his anxieties. He wrote to systematically dismantle them. Every cold morning he survived was a debt incurred, and he owed the gods his duty in return.
So if we take that ancient Roman emperor and map him onto the modern listener, imagine you were listening to this right now. You were sitting in traffic, commuting to a job you endure rather than love, just to pay a mortgage on a house where you might feel completely unappreciated by your family.
It's a reality for a lot of guys.
Yeah. And then when your corporate HR department emails you a mandate to practice gratitude for your workplace, it doesn't feel like a genuine philosophical practice.
Not at all.
It's like being forced to keep a gratitude journal by the very system that's currently extracting your labor. It feels less like wellness and more like a linguistic tranquilizer.
Linguistic tranquilizer is a great way to summarize Riker's point. And it perfectly aligns with his introduction of Jack Brem's 1966 theory of psychological reactance.
What did Brem figure out?
Brem was studying human motivation, specifically what happens when behavioral freedom is threatened. His theory of psychological reactance demonstrates that when individuals perceive their autonomy being restricted, for instance, by heavy-handed, persuasive attempts, like a boss or a culture commanding you to feel a certain emotion, they experience an intense motivational state aimed at restoring that freedom.
They rebel. That's the classic, don't tell me what to do, don't tell me how to feel.
Precisely. The brain literally perceives the command as an attack on its autonomy.
Right.
So when a man is relentlessly providing the literal infrastructure for his family or his company, but his structural grievances, his exhaustion, his lack of authority are completely ignored, and then a therapist or an HR rep commands him to practice gratitude, he doesn't become thankful. His psychological reactance kicks in.
He gets deeply resentful.
He gets resentful because it violates his ontological need for autonomy.
Wait, unpack ontological need for me. It's a heavy word. You mean a need that is literally baked into a state of being?
Yes, ontology is the philosophical study of being. Riker argues that a man's need for respect and autonomy isn't just a social construct, it is baked into his biological and spiritual operating system. It is how he functions.
So it's not optional.
No. So Riker asks the reader to seriously audit their own life. Is what you are practicing actual gratitude, or is it extraction dressed up in therapeutic language?
Because forced gratitude just becomes a weapon.
Exactly. Forced gratitude, divorced from objective reality, becomes a weapon to keep a man docile. A man who feels vaguely blessed is compliant. A man who rigorously acknowledges a specific causal debt is dangerous to a corrupt system.
Because he starts asking questions.
Because he starts asking what is owed to whom and whether the overall arrangement is just.
Okay, so if passive gratitude is the anesthetic keeping the patient compliant, what is the actual surgery being performed on men while they are numbed out? Like, how is society extracting this labor?
That is the pivotal transition in the book. If you understand how the numbing agent works, you have to look at the extraction. Riker calls this the hidden tax.
The hidden tax.
And this is where his critique of modern culture hits incredibly hard. He defines the hidden tax explicitly as the systemic extraction of male provision and protection paired with the simultaneous cultural denial of male authority and dignity.
And to set the historical baseline for this, he brings up the sinking of the Titanic, which is a visceral, grim comparison. Walk us through how he uses that.
Riker uses the Titanic to illustrate the historical social contract. In 1912, the RMS Titanic strikes an iceberg and begins to sink. The order given by the captain is women and children first.
Right.
Now, modern retellings often frame this as a sort of polite, gentlemanly agreement, like everyone just politely stepped aside.
Yeah, the movie version of it.
Right. But Riker points out that it was nothing of the sort. It was a moral command enforced by armed crewmen. Men were held back, sometimes at gunpoint, to ensure women could board the lifeboats.
The survival statistics are pretty stark, aren't they?
They are brutal. The survival rate was roughly 25% for men and 76% for women. That freezing night in the Atlantic established, or rather violently enforced, a noble but entirely asymmetrical standard of male disposability.
When push comes to shove.
When the ship goes down, biological reality dictates that men must die so others may live.
But Riker's point is that back in 1912, those men got something in exchange for that disposability, right? It wasn't just a one-way street where they die for nothing.
Exactly. They got honor, their names were inscribed on monuments, society acknowledged the massive weight of what was asked of them, the chivalry, the fatal sacrifice was demanded, but the gratitude, the respect, and the familial authority were freely given in return. It was an economic and social trade.
And today?
The book argues that over a century later, the deadly obligation remains entirely entrenched in our culture. I mean, men still make up the vast majority of combat deaths and workplace fatalities, but the honor has been expropriated.
Stripped away completely.
According to Riker, modern society expects you to bleed for it, while simultaneously calling your very nature toxic.
He tracks the legal enforcement of this hidden tax to a very specific moment in history, which I found fascinating. He points to California in 1969.
Yes. The introduction of the Family Law Act of 1969, signed by Governor Ronald Reagan, which legalized no-fault divorce.
Right.
Riker argues this was the specific legal mechanism that transformed protective duty into enforced disposability. It shifted the burden from the hearth to the courthouse.
How does he explain the mechanics of that shift? Like, how did it actually change the structure?
Well, historically, a man assumed the heavy burden of providing for a family, but that burden was balanced by a covenant. It was a binding legal and social contract. He was rewarded with a baseline of control, societal esteem, and the security of a lasting home.
There's a locked-in deal.
Yeah. But no-fault divorce stripped the binding nature of that covenant away, turning it into an at-will arrangement. Under this new framework, Riker argues, a man could be removed from his home, separated from his children, and financially stripped of his assets without any requirement to prove objective wrongdoing on his part.
And to explain why this is so devastating, he brings in behavioral economics, specifically Kahneman and Tversky's work.
This is where Riker's analysis gets highly analytical. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky developed prospect theory in 1979, which introduced the concept of loss aversion.
Define loss aversion for us.
Through rigorous psychological testing, they proved that human beings experience the pain of a loss roughly twice as intensely as the joy of an equivalent gain.
Okay, so losing $100 physically hurts your brain twice as much as finding $100 feels good.
Exactly. The negative impact scales aggressively.
Okay, so map that onto a man going through the modern family court system. Imagine you're that guy. You've worked for a decade to build a life, and suddenly the contract is dissolved without your consent.
Kahneman's math becomes terrifying when applied to this scenario. In a divorce, a man doesn't just lose one thing. He is stripped of his daily access to his children, his physical home, his societal reputation as a patriarch, and a massive chunk of his future income via alimony and child support.
All at the same time.
All simultaneously. Riker points out that the psychological toll isn't just additive, it is exponentially compounded by loss aversion. It is a catastrophic psychological trauma. Yet the dominant cultural narrative denies men the vocabulary to even express this loss.
Right, because if a man complains about this structural disadvantage, the culture has a ready-made response.
Yes. The culture tells men they are simply experiencing equality. They are told their suffering is just the messy correction of historical imbalance.
Let me push back on that for a second on behalf of the mainstream view. Because a sociologist would likely argue exactly that, right? That historically, men held all the economic and legal power. So if we are moving toward a truly egalitarian society, the dismantling of that patriarchal power structure is going to feel like a loss to men, but it's fundamentally necessary for justice. How does Riker counter that?
Riker anticipates that exact counter-argument. He doesn't deny history. He acknowledges that unchecked historical power could corrupt, and that specific legal corrections like women's suffrage or independent property rights were legitimate.
Okay.
However, he introduces a logical tool he calls the debate trap to expose what he terms the equivocation fallacy in the modern definition of equality.
Okay, the equivocation fallacy, meaning the culture is using the exact same word, equality, to mean two completely different things, depending on what is most convenient for the person arguing.
Precisely. Riker argues that in modern discourse, the word equality has been weaponized through equivocation. When feminists or institutions talk about equality in desirable areas like corporate boardrooms, STEM fields, or political representation, they define equality as equal outcomes. They demand a 50-50 split.
Right. They want the numbers to match.
But, Riker points out, they maintain a definition of equal opportunity or completely ignore the metrics when it comes to undesirable obligations.
Right, the dirty, dangerous jobs.
Exactly. Women are not drafted into the selective service. Women do not agitate for equal representation in deep-sea welding, roofing, or sewer maintenance.
Nobody's protesting for parity in garbage collection.
No, they aren't. Riker cites the statistic that men absorb roughly 92.5% of all workplace fatalities in the United States. Furthermore, men are still expected to be the primary financial providers in the majority of marriages, and they are legally compelled to fund households for which they have been evicted in divorce.
So the goalposts keep moving.
The definition of equality constantly shifts. It's equal outcomes when women lag, but it's traditional obligations when men are required to pay or bleed.
He calls it a one-way valve of extraction. It only flows out of the man, never back toward him.
That is the hidden tax. And Riker actually issues a challenge to the reader in the book. He says, name a single historical male privilege that did not carry a corresponding, often life-threatening male obligation.
Wow.
Voting historically was intrinsically tied to the military draft and bucket brigades. Property ownership was tied to the absolute legal and financial liability for all dependents. Power was never free, it was leased in exchange for blood and treasure.
So if a man recognizes this one-way valve, if he sees the mathematical asymmetry of the hidden tax and attempts to point it out, how does the system keep him from just walking away? Because the legal system is extracting resources from men, as you just explained. They must have a psychological enforcement mechanism to keep men participating, right?
That is the exact logical progression of the book. If you can't defeat a man's argument economically or legally, you have to silence him psychologically.
Right.
And the mechanism used to silence men today is to change the vocabulary from economics to therapy.
Which brings us to the therapy trap and the pathologizing of male strength. This is where the book gets incredibly incisive about how language is manipulated.
Riker traces this brilliantly by starting with the etymology of the word therapia.
The Greek root.
Right, in ancient Greek, it meant service or attendance, but specifically it meant attendance to objective truth or healing through alignment with reality.
Okay, alignment with reality.
But Riker argues the modern therapeutic framework has completely inverted this meaning. Today, therapy speak essentially means yielding to the subjective emotional narrative of whoever asserts victimhood or harm most loudly.
It's all about feelings now.
It acts as a linguistic tool to frame conventional male strengths, stoicism, calmness, endurance, logical detachment, as psychological flaws.
He describes the concept of toxic masculinity as a Kafka trap, which is a fascinating rhetorical concept. Explain how a Kafka trap works mechanically.
A Kafka trap is named after the author Franz Kafka, specifically his novel The Trial, where the protagonist, Joseph K., is arrested but never told what his crime is.
Right.
In a Kafka trap, the rhetorical structure is rigged so that any attempt to defend yourself against an accusation is immediately used as further proof of your guilt.
So it's an unwinnable game.
It is a hermetic, airtight loop. Applied to toxic masculinity, Riker explains it like this. If a man is accused of being toxic by his partner or by HR, and he defends himself by arguing, no, masculinity has protective virtues that are necessary, he is told his defensive anger proves he's toxic.
Right, the defense itself is the crime.
Exactly. If, on the other hand, he stays silent, refuses to argue, and remains stoic, he is accused of being emotionally avoidant or stonewalling, which the therapeutic state frames as a symptom of toxicity. It is an unfalsifiable trap.
And its real purpose.
Its function is not to diagnose a genuine psychological problem, but to silence male dissent.
It's like society is charging a man $200 an hour for a therapy session just to convince him that his armor, his emotional restraint, his ability to not fall apart in a crisis which he literally needs to survive, is actually a disease that needs to be cured.
That is precisely Riker's critique of the therapeutic state. The hidden premise is that male stoicism equals emotional avoidance, while female emotional expression equals psychological well-being.
But he backs this up with data.
He does. He doesn't just make a philosophical argument here. He brings in the hard data. He points to the research of Stanford psychologist James Gross on emotional regulation.
What did Gross's research actually show?
Gross studies how people manage their emotions, specifically comparing two strategies, expressive suppression and cognitive reappraisal. The modern therapeutic culture demands ventilation, letting it all out, venting your anger or sadness.
Right, getting it off your chest.
But Gross's studies show that constantly venting negative emotions often leads to rumination, which reinforces the negative state. It actually makes you feel worse.
Oh, wow.
Conversely, cognitive reappraisal, which is the ability to logically reframe a situation and suppress the outward emotional outburst, actually yields superior long-term psychological resilience.
Which is exactly what the ancient Stoics were doing.
Exactly. The Stoic sage didn't vent his grief to a paid stranger. He examined it, named its irrational structure, and discarded what failed the test of reason. Riker argues that modern psychology is slowly catching up to what Roman emperors knew 2,000 years ago, yet pop culture continues to demand emotional ventilation and punishes men who refuse to comply.
And the vocabulary of that punishment has mutated too. Riker points out how words like gaslighting have been completely hijacked.
The linguistic drift is very telling. Riker reminds the reader of the origin of gaslighting. It comes from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband deliberately and systematically manipulates the physical environment, literally dimming the gas lights in the house to make his wife believe she is losing her sanity so he can steal from her.
So it was calculated malicious behavior.
It described severe, deliberate, psychopathic abuse.
But today you hear it on every reality TV show and TikTok video.
Right. Riker argues it has become a catch-all weapon for cognitive dissonance. Anytime a man sets a rigid boundary, disagrees with a narrative, or presents factual, objective evidence that contradicts a woman's subjective emotional state, he is accused of gaslighting her.
The meaning is just gone.
Subjective emotional feelings are now treated as objective reality, and male logic is treated as abuse. It's a linguistic mechanism to shut down male appeals to reason.
So if a man's internal defense mechanism, his stoicism, his emotional regulation, is labeled toxic, and his logical appeals are labeled as gaslighting, what happens to his drive to engage with the world? I mean, how does a man function if his internal operating system is deemed defective?
He stops functioning at full capacity. His engine stalls. And that introduces Riker's concept of the economy of respect, which is perhaps the most profound biological metaphor in the book. Riker posits that a man's soul has a metabolism, and the non-negotiable fuel, the literal ATP for that metabolic engine, is respect.
So it's not just that men want respect to feed their egos. It's that respect acts as the energy currency that allows a man to process the heavy lifting of his duties. If you cut off the fuel, the engine stops.
That is the exact mechanism. When modern institutions, whether it's corporate HR departments, mainstream media, or the education system, systematically withhold this currency, men don't just complain, they shut down.
They just check out.
Right. Riker argues that society constantly misdiagnoses this shutdown. We see articles about the failure to launch, or men being lazy, or the Peter Pan syndrome of men refusing to grow up and take on responsibilities. But Riker insists this is a fundamental misreading of the situation.
He argues they aren't lazy, they are acting highly rationally.
Yes, and to prove it, he applies B.F. Skinner's principles of operant conditioning to societal behavior.
Let's break that down for the listener. How does a Skinner box work, and how does it explain male dropout rates?
B.F. Skinner was a behaviorist who studied how consequences shape behavior. He put rats in a box with a lever. If the rat pressed the lever and received a food pellet, which is positive reinforcement, it would press the lever more often. If the lever shocked the rat, punishment, it would stop pressing it.
Makes sense.
But the most interesting phenomenon is what happens when you completely disconnect the lever. The rat presses it and nothing happens. No food, no shock, just a void. Skinner proved that behavior that is completely ignored undergoes what is called extinction. The rat eventually just sits in the corner and stops trying.
So map that onto a modern man.
Imagine a man who commutes 2 hours a day, works a stressful job, pays the majority of the bills, and comes home. He is pressing the lever of provision and protection.
Over and over.
But if he receives zero respect, zero honor, and zero authority in return from his culture or his family, if his effort is treated as a baseline expectation and his struggles are ignored, his drive to do those things undergoes neurological extinction.
Wow.
He is reacting rationally to an ecosystem that penalizes ambition and rewards mediocrity. Why press the lever if the pellet of respect is never coming?
And pop culture reinforces this extinction schedule every single day. The book cites a very revealing University of Indiana study about primetime television.
It's a study that analyzed how fathers are portrayed in family sitcoms and dramas. It found that fathers are portrayed negatively, or as the butt of the joke, nearly 70% of the time on TV.
70%? That's insane.
They are depicted as incompetent buffoons, selfish, or emotionally stunted children who need their wives to manage them. Riker argues this isn't just lazy comedy writing, it is a programmed degradation of the male image.
It's conditioning.
It trains women to suppress respect for men by viewing them as inherently ridiculous, and it trains men to expect disrespect as the normal, unavoidable baseline of existence.
And nowhere is this extinction of respect more volatile than in the realm of dating and marriage. The book gets deep into the geometry of courtship and biological hypergamy. It argues that the 1960s Cultural Revolution completely screwed over the average guy. Walk me through the economics of that.
Riker's economic analysis of the sexual marketplace is brutal but mathematically sound. He argues that before the 1960s, there was an explicit, structurally enforced principle of delayed reciprocity.
How did that work?
Men exchanged their surplus provisioning, their ability to build a house and generate income, and their physical protection for a woman's youth, fidelity, and exclusive reproductive excess. It was a trade balanced by cultural and religious institutions.
But the sexual revolution promised to dismantle that rigid exchange to, liberate everyone.
Right. But Riker argues that by removing all structural and cultural restraints on female hypergamy, the revolution didn't liberate the average man.
Define hypergamy, just to be clear for everyone.
Hypergamy is the biological and evolutionary drive in females to mate up the socioeconomic and dominance hierarchy. Women naturally seek out men who are taller, stronger, wealthier, and higher status than themselves.
Okay, so they look upward.
Riker argues that historically monogamy forced a redistribution of mating opportunities. allowing the average middle-class man to build a family. But the sexual revolution deregulated this market. It turned the sexual marketplace into an unregulated monopoly.
Like a winner-take-all scenario.
Exactly. Without cultural constraints, mating power consolidated into the hands of a tiny percentage of high-status men, the top 10 or 20%, while entirely starving the middle-class and working-class men of familial prospects. So how does a man operate in a system that views his innate desire as predatory, but views female hypergamous desire as an absolute, unconstrained right? It sounds like a rigged casino where the house always wins. Riker doesn't just diagnose the rigged game, he offers a very specific structural solution for the individual man, which he calls the mutual accord protocol. Because he recognizes you can no longer operate on unspoken traditional assumptions, you have to make the implicit explicit.
What does the protocol actually entail? What does a guy do?
The mutual accord protocol explicitly defines respect as a non-negotiable currency in relationships. It is a conscious, stated agreement that a man will offer his strength, his provision, and his protection in exchange for genuine regard, peace, and structural authority in his home.
And if he doesn't get it?
Crucially, Riker emphasizes that a man must be willing to withdraw both his resources and his physical presence if that exchange is refused. It's not a manipulative ultimatum. It is a man establishing the bedrock of reality. If the engine doesn't get fuel, the engine leaves.
But to maintain that kind of frame, to have the psychological strength to walk away or set those rigid boundaries against a culture that will immediately call him toxic for doing so, a man cannot rely solely on himself, right? Like, he needs backing.
Absolutely not. He will break if he is alone. And that is a perfect conceptual link to Riker's next major theme, the war on male spaces. Riker argues that the institutions running the system know that a solitary man is easily demoralized and broken, which is precisely why they declared a cultural war on exclusive male fraternities.
He makes a really sharp philosophical distinction here between solitude and isolation. I think a lot of guys confuse the two.
It's a critical distinction for male mental health. Isolation is a forced penalty. It is a state of deprivation where a man is cut off from his peers by circumstance, depression, or enemy action. It breaks a man down. Solitude, however, is a strategic, intentional withdrawal. It is an act of power.
And he points to the Desert Fathers to illustrate this. Who were they, and why does Riker use them as an archetype?
The Desert Fathers were early Christian hermits and ascetics who lived in the Egyptian desert in the 3rd century. At the time, the Roman Empire was entering the crisis of the 3rd century. It was rotting from administrative bloat, economic inflation, and political corruption.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. Modern secular historians often frame these monks as religious fanatics running away from reality. Riker argues the exact opposite. They were running toward reality.
How so?
They realized the society of Rome was built on illusions and decadence. They strategically withdrew into the harsh solitude of the desert to strip away the noise and the political games of a declining empire. They embraced asceticism to forge mental toughness and spiritual clarity. They needed bedrock, away from the corrupting influence of the city.
And the modern equivalent of that bedrock, when a man is in temporary solitude, is what Riker calls the Brotherhood Forge.
Yes. While solitude is necessary for internal calibration, fraternity is necessary for sustained external resistance. Riker looks at the Latin root frater. He notes that historically, it didn't mean your fantasy football buddies or the guys you drink beer with on a Saturday.
Right, it meant something much deeper.
It meant oath-bound solidarity and mutual correction. Think of the Roman legions or the Benedictine monks. It was an alliance built on shared physical sacrifice, shared risk, and the relentless, often harsh pursuit of objective truth. It was iron sharpening iron.
But today, the culture heavily pushes the lone wolf archetype. You see it everywhere online, the Sigma male, out on his own, needing nobody, trusting nobody.
Riker calls the lone wolf archetype a deliberate myth pushed by corporations and the state.
Why would they push that?
Because isolated men are highly compliant. A massive corporation wants transient, disconnected workers with no loyalty to anyone but their middle manager. The state wants atomized taxpayers who have no fraternities to pool resources, fund legal challenges, or build alternative power structures.
So division is control.
Exactly. Men who trust each other coordinate. Men who coordinate resist tyranny. Therefore, the system prefers the lone wolf, because a lone wolf is just a stray dog waiting to be put in a pound.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a moment, because someone listening might say, look, We've dismantled male spaces because of the very real dangers of toxic locker room culture, or fraternity hazing, or the old boys club covering up crimes. There are real historical examples of male groups doing terrible things. Does Riker address that?
He addresses it head on. Riker conceives that male groups, when untethered from virtue, can become vicious and destructive. But he calls the modern institutional objection a massive category error.
Explain the category error.
The culture conflates unstructured, immature, leaderless groups of boys with disciplined, mature, purpose-driven brotherhood. It's like saying because cancer is a mutation of cells, we should surgically remove all organs.
That's a great way to put it.
The existence of diseased tissue doesn't negate the necessity of the organ. But Riker argues the system uses a guilt by association fallacy to do exactly that.
They use the worst examples of male behavior to justify shutting down all male spaces.
Exactly. And he points out the massive double standard here. Society frames sisterhood and female-only spaces as empowering, necessary, and vital for women to support each other against oppression. But it frames brotherhood and male-only spaces as a dangerous conspiracy requiring institutional infiltration and dismantling. Same behavior, entirely different framing.
Riker points to psychological research on group polarization to explain why institutions are so terrified of men gathering. What is that research?
Group polarization is a concept pioneered by James Stoner in 1961, initially called the risky shift. It's a psychological tendency for a group of like-minded individuals to make decisions that are more extreme or resolute than the initial inclinations of its members.
Right, the echo chamber effect.
Modern academia always frames this negatively, as a warning about echo chambers and radicalization.
But Riker views it differently.
Riker argues that institutions only fear male group polarization because it shifts authority away from the approved institutional managers, away from the HR departments, the diversity consultants, and the therapists, and puts authority back into independent male truth-seeking.
It creates an alternative power center.
Yes. When men get together in a trusted space, the group polarization effect emboldens them to speak objective truths that they would be fired for saying in the corporate boardroom.
Because if a man has a brother who tells him the hard truth to his face, he doesn't need to pay a state-licensed therapist to validate his feelings. He has an alternative source of reality.
Precisely. And this dismantling of male hierarchies and truth-seeking isn't just happening in social clubs. It has become the dominant structural political ideology of our institutions, which perfectly sets up Riker's deep dive into the politics of order versus what he calls the cult of equity.
This is a heavy section. This is the core men's rights and red pill critique of how our institutions were captured by Marxist and egalitarian frameworks. Riker contrasts modern equity with the historical definition of justice.
Yes, he traces the etymology of justice back to the Latin justitia, which meant righteousness or equity based on merit, giving each man his specific due based on his actions. True justice, traditionally, is a scale-balancing contribution and reward.
He takes us all the way back to ancient Athens to illustrate this, right? 508 BC.
The reforms of Cleisthenes. Cleisthenes reorganized the political structure of Athens, effectively laying the groundwork for democracy. But it wasn't a free-for-all. Cleisthenes tied political voice directly to skin in the game.
You had to earn it.
You got the franchise, the right to vote in the assembly if you bore arms as a hoplite, paid taxes, and literally staked your physical life on the city's survival in the phalanx. Power followed sacrifice. Authority was inextricably linked to physical obligation.
But today, the buzzword isn't justice or merit. We hear the word equity mandated in every corporate and government policy.
And Riker argues that modern equity is an inversion of justitia. He calls it simply envy consecrated as public virtue. Equity, in the modern bureaucratic sense, demands equal outcomes based on identity categories, regardless of individual contribution, physical capability, or merit. It chops down the tall trees to match the short ones so no one feels insecure.
He does this amazing surgical slogan autopsy on the phrase we hear everywhere, diversity is our strength.
He calls that phrase an unfalsifiable, thought-terminating cliche.
Unpack that. What is a thought-terminating cliche?
It's a phrase used to halt cognitive dissonance and end debate. When someone says diversity is our strength, its function is not to describe empirical reality or invite statistical analysis. Its function is to mandate the dismantling of meritocratic standards.
It's a shield.
Exactly. If a diverse team succeeds, it is credited to diversity. If a diverse team catastrophically fails, the failure is blamed on systemic bias or poor implementation, never on the concept itself. The phrase is immune to evidence.
And the book gives a chilling, concrete, physical example of this. fire departments.
It is a perfect example of ideology clashing with physics. Historically, fire departments had rigorous physical standards based on the absolute maximum demands of a burning building. You had to deadlift a 165-pound dummy, climb multiple flights of stairs in heavy turnout gear, and breach doors.
Because the fire doesn't care who you are.
Right. But to accommodate demographic quotas and recruit female firefighters who biologically struggle to meet those extreme upper body strength requirements, departments across the country systematically lowered or altered their physical tests.
They changed the standards from an absolute measure of the job to a relative measure of the applicant.
Exactly. Riker notes that the consequences are not theoretical. They are measurable in physics and blood. Lowered physical standards lead to increased injury rates for the firefighters and decreased operational effectiveness in saving civilians. Riker calls it human sacrifice on the altar of ideological conformity.
That's a brutal way to phrase it, but I see his point.
The bureaucracy is willing to accept a higher rate of physical failure in reality to achieve a perfect demographic pie chart on paper.
I think about it this way. When a bureaucracy says they want to dismantle the system, Riker argues we should hear a direct translation. What they are really saying is, we wish to install ourselves as the new untouchable oligarchs.
Yeah, that's the core of it.
It's not about casting the most competent, physically capable person for the job. It's literal theatrical casting for a political narrative. It's putting someone in a role because of what demographic they represent, not what physical tasks they can execute under pressure.
That leads directly to the core syllogism of Riker's critique of institutions. He lays it out with ruthless logic. Complex human systems, things like hospitals, the military, the aviation industry, the electrical grid, require highly competent meritocratic leadership to function without catastrophic failure.
Right.
Egalitarian policies explicitly and intentionally lower meritocratic standards to achieve demographic representation targets. This systematically replaces highly competent personnel with demographically selected, less competent personnel. Therefore, egalitarianism systematically increases the probability of catastrophic failure in complex systems.
It's just built into the math. If you optimize for anything other than competence, competence drops.
It is unavoidable. And Riker takes it a step further. He argues that this mediocrity isn't a bug in the system, it's the primary design feature.
Why would a system want mediocrity?
Because bureaucracies value compliance over excellence. They don't want fiercely independent, highly competent craftsmen who hold themselves accountable to objective truth and the laws of physics.
They can't control those guys.
No, those men are dangerous to a bureaucracy. They resist stupid orders. They point out when the emperor has no clothes. The bureaucratic state vastly prefers the docile diversity hire whose entire employment and status depends strictly on ideological compliance and who will never threaten the political system that artificially installed them.
So imagine you are a man listening to this right now. You see the institutions visibly failing around you. You see the meritocracy being dismantled. You realize the culture is openly hostile to your nature and extracts your labor without respect. How do you survive that without just becoming totally black-pilled and giving up? How do you build?
You turn to the crucible. And that brings us to the final and most crucial philosophical shift in the book. The actionable philosophy found in Riker's conclusion, the Stoic crucible and the generative imperative. This is about shifting from merely surviving the decay of the West to building a strategic legacy in spite of it.
And it centers heavily on the Stoic concept of amor fati, love of fate. But that term gets misused a lot to mean just rolling over and taking it.
Yes, Riker is very clear that amor fati is not passive surrender. It is not nihilism. It is the active, aggressive alchemy of adversity. To explain the psychology of this, he cites Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun's 1996 psychological research on post-traumatic growth.
We hear about PTSD all the time. What is PTG, post-traumatic growth?
Tedeschi and Calhoun developed an inventory to measure how individuals respond to severe trauma. What they found empirically proved what the Stoics knew dialectically, while trauma breaks many people, for a specific subset of resilient individuals. Trauma, when metabolized correctly, becomes the engine of profound psychological evolution.
It forces them to level up.
They measured growth in 5 domains, including personal strength, new possibilities, and a deepened philosophy of life. The fire of trauma burns away the superficial.
So the goal isn't avoidance.
Exactly. Riker argues the goal of a sane society isn't to wrap young men in bubble wrap, medicate their rough edges, and protect them from all harm. The goal is to forge men strong enough to face the inevitable devastation that life will bring.
Because you can't stop the fire.
The fire of reality doesn't care if you are soft, it just burns. You have to consciously decide to be forged like steel rather than melted like wax.
And the book gives a highly specific daily practice for this to ensure it doesn't just remain an abstract philosophy. He calls it the morning ledger of dew.
This is how Riker operationalizes stoic gratitude, so it isn't just a fleeting pumpkin spice feeling. Every morning, a man writes down specific, concrete, material debts he owes to the forebears who built his world. You do not write vague platitudes like, I'm grateful for my health.
You have to trace the supply chain.
Yes. You write, the polio immunization I received in 1987 was developed by researchers who dedicated their lives to a lab. It was funded by taxpayers who traded their labor for that money, and it was administered in a hospital built by men who laid brick in the August heat, some of whom died falling off the scaffolding.
Wow, that's heavy.
You force your brain to trace the causal chain backward. You force yourself to see the heavy cost of your baseline comfort.
So how does a man take this ledger, this intense, almost overwhelming awareness of the debt of existence, and use it to push back against a corporate and cultural world that demands his silent compliance?
He embraces the root of the word generative, the Latin generare. It means to beget, to father, to bring into being. Riker argues that a man's rigorous gratitude must convert his temporary breath into permanent structure. If you just consume products, if you just work for a corporation that hates you so you can buy things you don't need to impress people who despise you, you are operating as a mercenary for another man's legacy.
You're just passing through.
You are a background utility. Riker states that the modern consumer age wants men to measure their abundance by what goes into their mouths, what they consume, what media they watch, what food they eat. But the generative man measures his abundance entirely by what leaves his hands.
The structures he builds.
The physical structures he builds, the unyielding discipline he transmits to his children, the local community he protects. He refuses to be a passive appliance.
I love that. It's about refusing to be a background utility.
Exactly. I want to emphasize to you, the listener, Riker's ultimate conclusion. Your virtue, your discipline, and your clear-eyed gratitude matter. They do not matter because they will make you feel warm and fuzzy or earn you a pat on the back from a hostile culture. They matter because the arc of history bends toward whatever the strongest wills impose upon it.
That's a powerful thought.
If the strongest wills belong to men without virtue, the arc bends toward tyranny and collapse.
Consider this as we wrap up. If the book is right, and our modern institutions are deliberately replacing competence with compliance and physics with ideology, then the ultimate act of rebellion isn't holding a protest sign or arguing with strangers online.
Not at all.
The ultimate rebellion is quietly, rigorously mastering a hard physical skill. Because when the bridges built by quotas inevitably fall, when the complex systems fail because they prioritize demographics over competence, physics will not negotiate with HR departments. Gravity will not attend a diversity seminar. The world will be forced by sheer survival instinct to turn back to the men who remember how to build and protect.
That is the immovable weight of reality.
If you want to dive deeper into this framework, if you want to understand the history of our institutions and learn how to audit your own life's ledger, you absolutely must read this book. We strongly urge you to buy Cultivating Gratitude, Generative Positivity Tempered by Stoicism by Conrad Riker on Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books.
And please don't forget to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack for more of his ongoing in-depth analysis.
Thank you so much for joining us in the deep end today. Please hit that like button, subscribe to the show, and we will see you on the next deep dive.